Have you ever wondered why, even in silence, your mind doesn't seem to stop for a second, as if there was a constant voice, repeating fears, memories, and thoughts that you never invited in, but you can't expel either? There are nights when the body is tired, but the mind remains lit, restless, as if it were stuck in a cycle that does not break. And the strangest thing is that, on the outside, everything may even seem normal, but on the inside there is an invisible battle going on right now. It's as if time slows down inside your own head. Thoughts that come back, sensations that tighten your chest, doubts that whisper in the dark. You try to ignore it. You try to distract yourself. You try to move on. But deep down, you know that there is something deeper going on. Something that cannot be solved with effort or distraction alone. What if I told you that this darkness is not random? That there is an origin, and more importantly, a way to be removed completely? There is something that few realize, something that has always been present, but that most have never really learned to access. It is not a common technique, nor something that the world teaches. It is a spiritual key, simple in appearance but powerful in essence. An ancient truth which has been forgotten by many, but which is still active, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Because the truth is, there is a light that can invade even the darkest corners of the mind. A light that not only clears, but rearranges, restores, and transforms everything it touches. From the beginning, this has already been established. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1:3. This was not just a creation of the world, it was a spiritual pattern, and perhaps what you never realized is that that same voice still speaks today. In the midst of the noise, in the midst of the confusion, there is a truth that keeps echoing, waiting to be heard. Jesus said something that few truly understand. "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." John 8:32. It's not about knowing, it's about experiencing. There is a way out of this cycle. It is not complicated, but it is not obvious either. And what will be revealed here is not theory. It is something alive, something that if you stay until the end, can begin to act within you even today. Because when that light comes in, the darkness has no choice but to leave. On this path that we are starting now, you will notice something different happening within you. Every word, every teaching, has been chosen to touch exactly the areas where the mind suffers the most in silence. You will understand how God confronts thoughts that hold you back, how the mind can be renewed in a real way, and how to recognize His voice even in the midst of chaos. Nothing here is distant or theoretical. Everything points to a practical and spiritual transformation that can begin today. The word itself warns us, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Romans 12:2. As we move forward, it will be as if something begins to clear up inside, as if old answers have finally found space. And if that message has already started to speak to you, don't ignore it. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, you help that light reach others who are also struggling in the dark. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when God decides to intervene in the chaos. And it is not when everything is organized, nor when the mind finally finds answers. It is precisely at the darkest, most confusing, most disordered point. The Bible describes this scenario precisely. "But the earth was without form and void. There was darkness on the face of the deep." Genesis 1:2. There was no structure, there was no disher, there was no meaning, just a deep emptiness shrouded in darkness. And maybe, if you're honest with yourself, you'll realize that you felt this way inside. Disconnected thoughts, out-of-control emotions, a feeling of being lost inside your own mind. As if something was out of place, but you didn't know exactly what. And the most unsettling thing is that many times you try to organize it yourself. You try to understand, you try to control, you try to find a logical way out. But nothing seems to really solve it. What almost no one realizes is that God doesn't wait for that moment of clarity to act. He doesn't come in when everything is fine. He comes in just when he's formless, when he's empty, when it's dark. It changes everything. Because it means your confusion isn't an obstacle to God, it's his starting point. And then something happens. There is no human effort, there is no strategy, there is no rational explanation, just a voice, a word released in the midst of chaos. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1:3. Notice this. The light did not come because the scenario improved. The light came because God spoke. Here's one of the deepest secrets Jesus came to reveal. Transformation doesn't start when you understand. It starts when God speaks. The mind may be in disarray, but when the right voice comes in, everything starts to line up. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. That's why so many remain stuck even as they seek answers. Because they're trying to clear their minds without listening to the voice that truly has the power to transform. And while other voices continue to take up space, fear, doubt, insecurity, darkness remains. But when God's voice finds space, something changes immediately. Maybe not visible at first, but real. The confusion begins to lose strength. The weight begins to lessen. The mind begins to breathe again. Because light does not negotiate with darkness. It simply takes its place. And if you've made it this far, maybe it's not by chance. Maybe that's exactly the moment when something inside you starts to be reorganized, even if you can't explain it yet. If that message touched something deep inside, don't ignore it. Sometimes the first sign of light is this feeling that you can't describe. If this made sense to you, write in the comments, Amen. It may seem simple, but often a small answer is the beginning of a big transformation. There's a kind of storm that doesn't happen on the outside. It happens inside the mind, and the scariest thing is that no one sees it. On the outside, everything seems under control, but inside the thoughts churn like violent waves, crashing non-stop, creating a noise that doesn't let you rest. It's as if the mind never shuts down, as if it's always on the verge of losing control. And the more you try to calm down, the more it feels like everything intensifies. Now imagine the disciples inside that boat, the strong wind, the waves rushing in, the fear growing by the second. They were surrounded by a real storm, but what dominated at that moment was not just the external danger, it was the internal panic. And that's exactly what happens to the mind when fear takes over. It amplifies everything. It makes the problem seem bigger, more threatening, more impossible to face. And then, in the midst of that chaos, Jesus rises, not in despair, not in haste, but in authority. He doesn't argue with the storm. He doesn't try to negotiate with the wind. He doesn't despair like the others. He simply releases a word. Then he arose, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Matthew 8:26. Notice this carefully. The storm has not been resolved piecemeal. It has been silenced, all at once. Because when the right authority enters the picture, chaos has no choice but to obey. Now bring that into you. How many times does your mind feel like that rough sea? How many times do thoughts come like waves, one after the other, giving you no room to breathe? And most importantly, who is in control at that moment? Because while fear rules, the storm continues. But when faith takes over, something begins to change. The mind only finds rest when it recognizes who is really in control. It's not about denying the problem or pretending that everything is fine. It's about understanding that there is an authority greater than any thought that tries to dominate you. Jesus didn't just calm the sea that day. He revealed a powerful spiritual principle. there is authority over chaos. And that authority is not far away. It manifests itself when you decide not to surrender to fear, when you choose to trust even though you don't understand, when you allow God's voice to be bigger than the noise inside your head. It is at this moment that the storm begins to lose strength. Maybe today your mind is exactly like this, agitated, tired, overloaded. But just like in that boat, everything can change from a single word released with faith. And if inside you there is this desire to hear that voice above all noise, don't ignore it. If this message is awakening something inside, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And leave your like on this video, because this can make that same peace reach other lives that are also facing their own storms. There is something even more subtle happening inside the mind, because not every thought you hear comes from God. And this is a point that many ignore, and that is why they remain stuck in confusion. After realizing that there is a voice capable of calming the storm, an inevitable question arises: how to recognize this voice in the midst of so many others? Because the noise does not stop. Ideas arise, memories appear, fears speak loudly, and everything seems mixed. That's exactly what happened to Elijah. After facing great battles, he found himself exhausted, emotionally shaken, with his mind overloaded. He was looking for God. He wanted answers. He wanted direction. And then something powerful happened. A strong wind blew through, breaking rocks. Then came an earthquake. Then came an intense fire. Staggering, noisy phenomena, impossible to ignore. But the Bible makes it clear, God was not in any of them. And then, after all this, silence. And in the midst of that silence, something almost imperceptible. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. This completely changes the way we understand how God speaks, because the human mind tends to associate God with the extraordinary, with the noise, with the visible impact. But most of the time, he chooses the opposite path. He speaks quietly. He speaks in silence. He speaks in a way that is only perceived by those who learn to slow down inside. And here's one of the deepest secrets to getting out of mental darkness: discernment. Not every thought that crosses your mind deserves to be heard. Not every voice that insists on speaking has authority over you. Without discernment, the mind becomes an open field where any idea can enter and settle. And that's how darkness grows, not by force, but by lack of filter. God's voice has a characteristic that cannot be ignored. It brings peace even when it confronts. It does not create confusion. It does not feed fear. It does not imprison. On the contrary, it aligns, directs, and calms. While other voices press, accelerate, and wear down, God's voice organizes and brings clarity. But to recognize this voice, you need to create space. Just as Elijah had to go through the noise to reach silence, the mind also needs to learn to be quiet. Because while everything is agitated inside, even the truth can go unnoticed. Maybe today what you need most is not more answers, but enough silence to hear the right voice. And if in the midst of all this you feel a light touch, a quiet direction, a peace that makes no sense, it could be exactly Him speaking to you right now. If this made sense in your heart, simply and sincerely, write in the comments, "God is speaking to me." Sometimes, acknowledging this is the first step to never getting lost in the noise again. There is a level of darkness in the mind that goes beyond negative thoughts. It is when one's own identity begins to be lost, when the person no longer recognizes himself, when he feels that something inside him has been taken, distorted, fragmented. And perhaps this is one of the most silent pains that someone can carry, because it is not always visible to others, but it is deeply real to those who live it. The Bible presents a man who got to exactly this point. The Gadarene demoniac was not just someone in trouble. He was completely overwhelmed by a force that no one could control. Living among tombs, isolated, hurting himself, rejected by everyone. They tried to arrest him, to restrain him, to help him by force, but nothing worked, because what imprisoned him was not external. It was something invisible, spiritual, that directly affected his mind. Now think sincerely. How many people today live something similar inside? Not in the same visible way, but with thoughts that imprison, feelings that suffocate, a constant feeling of being out of oneself. And the most difficult thing is that many times, not even they themselves can explain what is happening. But everything changes the moment Jesus enters the scene. He does not avoid that man. He does not turn away. He does not ignore the situation. He goes directly to meet him, and this reveals something powerful. No matter the level of darkness, God does not shrink from it. On the contrary, he draws near. Without human effort, without a long process, without negotiation. Just by the authority of Jesus' presence, that which dominated that man was expelled, and the result of this is described in a simple but deeply impactful way. And they found him clothed in his right mind. Mark 5:15. Realize the depth of it. The mind that was once chaos is now in order. The identity that was lost has now been restored. The dignity that had been destroyed is now back. This was not just an external liberation. It was a complete healing of the mind. And here is a truth that many have not yet understood. There are invisible oppressions that are not resolved by effort, logic, or willpower alone. There are areas of the mind that are only restored when the power of God comes into play. This does not mean weakness. It means recognizing that there are battles that are spiritual. And when this dimension is ignored, the person fights, but does not advance. However, when God enters, what seemed impossible begins to unravel. Maybe there are thoughts that have been with you for years. Maybe there are feelings that you've tried to overcome in every way. But this story shows that there is real liberation. There is complete restoration. There is a moment when the mind returns to its place, and perhaps this process has already begun within you, silently, as you listen to all of this. Because when the truth is released, something begins to move inside, even if you can't explain it yet. If you are here so far, it is not by chance. There is something being worked on within you, and it does not end here. In the end, there will be a moment of prayer, a real moment of surrender and connection with God. So stay until the end, because what is being prepared can mark a new beginning in your mind and in your life. There is a decisive point in the liberation of the mind that many ignore. It is not enough to expel the darkness. It is necessary to replace that which occupied the space, because an empty mind does not remain neutral for long. If it is not filled with the truth, sooner or later it will be occupied again by thoughts that confuse, distort, and imprison. That's why Jesus revealed something so direct and so profound at the same time. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. John 17:17. He wasn't just talking about a distant spiritual concept. He was showing a practical way. Truth isn't just something you believe. It's something that transforms, that cleanses, that reorganizes the mind from the inside out. Now think carefully. How many thoughts have you accepted as truth without question? How many times have negative ideas been repeated so much that they started to seem real? Internal phrases like, "I can't do it," "nothing changes," "it's too late." All of this creates an invisible structure within the mind. And when you realize it, you are already living based on something that was never true. Darkness feeds on exactly that, on repeated lies. It doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to impose itself. It just needs to whisper constantly until it is accepted. And this is how many minds remain trapped, not for lack of capacity, but for an excess of wrong thoughts taking up space. But when the truth comes in, it doesn't negotiate with the lie. It replaces, it corrects, it repositions. And that process begins when you decide to expose your mind to God's Word on an ongoing basis, not as an empty habit, but as a living source of renewal. The Word doesn't just inform, it forms. It builds a new way of thinking. Gradually, what it once dominated begins to lose strength. Thoughts that seemed fixed begin to dissolve, and a new structure is created, based not on fear, but on truth. And here's an essential detail. This process is not automatic, it's intentional. Just as someone chooses what they consume every day, the mind also needs to be fed with what generates light, because every thought you accept is like a seed planted inside you. Jesus didn't just teach us to reject error, he taught us to replace it with the truth, and that's what transforms permanently. It's not just about stopping thinking wrong, but learning to think right, based on what God says, not on what fear insists on repeating. Perhaps today you are realizing how many voices have taken up space within you over time. But the good news is that this can start to change now. The truth is already being released, and as you receive, something inside you begins to align. If this is making sense to you, simply but with intention, state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your truth." Write as a step of faith. And leave your like on this video, because it can bring that same light to other people who also need to renew their minds. There is something even deeper than confused thoughts. It is when one's own identity is built on a wrong foundation, because the way you see yourself defines the way you think, decide, and react. And if that identity is distorted, the whole mind starts to work from a silent lie. It doesn't matter how much you try to change on the outside, if on the inside you still believe that you are the same limited, trapped, or worthless person. Saul was exactly like that, convinced, determined, full of certainties, but completely out of line with the truth. He believed he was doing right, when in fact he was fighting against what came from God. His mind was so shaped by a wrong identity that he did not realize the darkness in which he lived. And this is one of the most dangerous states, when the person is in the dark but thinks he is in the light, until on the way to Damascus, everything changes. It was not a slow process, nor a transformation built gradually. It was an encounter, a strong light, a direct voice, a complete interruption in the course of his life. And in that moment, not only were his eyes impacted, his mind was confronted. Saul realizes that everything he believed about himself needed to be revised, and that's exactly what God does when he decides to remove the darkness from the mind. He doesn't just illuminate thoughts, he redefines who you are. From that meeting, Saul ceases to be who he was, not only in name, but in essence. His mentality changes, his purpose changes, his direction changes. And the most impressive thing is what happens soon after. And immediately he preached Christ, saying that this is the Son of God. Acts 9:20. The one who once persecuted now proclaims. The one who once lived in darkness now carries light. This reveals something powerful. When God transforms identity, the mind follows, because many of the thoughts that imprison don't just come from outside, they are born from the way the person sees himself. When someone believes that they are not capable, that they are not worthy, that they cannot change, those thoughts become patterns, and those patterns sustain the darkness. But when God comes in, he breaks that structure. He reveals a new identity, based not on the past, not on mistakes, not on limitations, but on purpose. And when that truth begins to be accepted, something changes profoundly within the mind. Old thoughts begin to lose strength because they no longer find the same basis. Maybe you've long carried a distorted view of yourself. Maybe words, experiences, or mistakes have shaped an identity that doesn't reflect who you really are before God. But that can be rewritten. Just like it was with Saul, it can happen to you. And if this message is touching something inside you, maybe it's because this process has already begun. God doesn't reveal without purpose. If you felt this living word, don't ignore it. Take this moment to do something simple but meaningful. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this allows this message to reach other people who also need to have their minds and identity restored. There is a detail that many overlook after experiencing moments of light. They think that the problem was solved only because they felt peace for a moment. But the truth is that the mind is not sustained in the light only by isolated experiences. There is a continuous daily need, almost like breathing, because the absence of God's presence does not leave a neutral space. It opens the way for darkness to return silently. Moses understood this in a way that few did. He wasn't content with just miracles, signs, or answers. To him, none of this made sense if God's presence wasn't there. At a decisive moment, he makes a statement that reveals the depth of his spiritual awareness, and the answer he receives changes everything. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Exodus 33:14. Rest, not only physical, but mental. Because the mind only finds true peace when it is close to the presence that sustains all things. Without this, even quiet days can hide an inner restlessness. But with that, even difficult moments carry a peace that cannot be explained. Now notice something important. The people of Israel had direction, they had promises, they had a destiny. But Moses knew that none of this would be enough without presence. Because it is presence that brings clarity when doubts arise. It is presence that brings direction when everything seems uncertain. It is presence that keeps the mind steady when circumstances try to destabilize. And here is a point that completely changes the way we live. It is not just about seeking God at specific times, but walking with Him continuously. The mind that remains close to the divine presence is not easily lost, because it is constantly being aligned. Maybe you've felt moments when everything seemed lighter, clearer, more at peace. And then, without realizing it, that feeling disappeared. That doesn't mean that something went wrong. It just means that the presence needs to be maintained, cultivated, constantly sought. The cloud that guided the people in the wilderness didn't just appear once. It remained. During the day, during the night, at every step. This shows that God does not desire occasional visits in your life. He desires continued closeness. And when that closeness becomes real, something powerful happens inside the mind. Thoughts begin to align effortlessly. Decisions become clearer. The weight decreases. Confusion loses space. Not because everything around you has changed, but because inside there is a presence that sustains. Maybe today what you need most is not more answers, but more presence. And that's available now, closer than you think. If while you were listening to this, someone came to your heart, someone who also needs this peace, don't ignore that feeling. Write that person's name in the comments. It could be someone in your family, a friend, someone who is going through a difficult time. By doing so, you join a chain of faith where each name presented here turns into a cry before God. And something begins to move when hearts unite in prayer. There is a silent mistake that makes many people return to exactly the same place they left. They experience moments of light, feel peace, perceive a lighter mind, but over time, without realizing it, everything begins to darken again, not abruptly but gradually. Small thoughts return, old sensations reappear, and when they realize it, they are again trapped in cycles that already seem to be overcome. This is because receiving light is just the beginning. Maintaining that light is the real challenge. And Jesus made it clear directly, bluntly, watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. Matthew 26:41. He didn't say this by chance. He knew that the human mind, if left unguarded, can easily be invaded again. To be vigilant is not to live in fear, it is to live with awareness. It is to perceive what enters, what remains, and what needs to be rejected. Because darkness rarely comes back in an evident way. It approaches in subtle thoughts, in constant distractions, in small concessions that seem harmless. And when there is no vigilance, these details begin to gain space. Prayer, on the other hand, is not just a spiritual moment. It is an ongoing connection that strengthens the mind. It keeps the heart aligned. It keeps sensitivity active. It keeps God's presence close. And when that happens, the mind becomes firmer, more stable, less vulnerable. Now think about it sincerely. How many times have you noticed that certain thoughts start small, almost imperceptible, but when you give them space, they grow? This is exactly how the darkness tries to return. Not like before, intensely, but strategically. That is why spiritual discipline becomes essential, not as a burden, but as a protection. Just as the body needs daily care, so does the mind. What you hear, what you see, what you feed inside yourself. All of this directly influences the internal environment. And when that discipline starts to be part of life, something changes. The mind becomes more watchful, more aware, more protected, not because there will never be attacks again, but because there is now preparation, there is a basis, there is a light being held, not just received. Perhaps you have experienced moments of clarity and peace, and then wondered why it did not remain. The answer lies not in the lack of faith, but in the need for continuity. Light needs to be cultivated every day, and the most powerful thing is to understand that this is not something distant or difficult. It starts with small decisions. Choose what to feed in the mind. Choose to seek the presence of God. Choose not to give space to what weakens, because in the end, it's not just about getting out of the darkness, but about never allowing it to dominate again. Nothing happens by chance. If you have made it this far, there is a purpose in it. Something is being built within you. Something is being aligned. So stay until the end, because there is still something much deeper being prepared, and it may be just what you need to live from today. There is a point in the spiritual journey where the mind conflicts with itself. On the one hand, there is the desire to move forward, to trust, to move forward. On the other, there is an almost urgent need to understand everything, to have guarantees, to see each step before taking the next one. And it is exactly in this space that many people are stuck, not because they do not want to move forward, but because they cannot deal with uncertainty. Abraham faced this same dilemma. When God called him, he didn't give him a map. He didn't explain all the details. He didn't show the full destination. He just gave a direction. And the most impressive thing wasn't the call, it was the answer. By faith, Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Hebrews 11:8. Not knowing where it was going. This phrase carries enormous weight because it goes against everything the human mind wants. The mind wants security, it wants control, it wants predictability. But God works in another dimension. He doesn't reveal everything at once because the goal is not just to show the way. It is to teach us to trust Him, and this is where many minds get confused, because mental darkness does not always come from evident negative thoughts. It is often born from the anxiety for answers, from the need to understand before obeying, from the attempt to control what can only be lived by faith. When the person tries to see everything before acting, he gets stuck. He stays still, analyzing, thinking, questioning, and the more he thinks, the more doubts arise. And this cycle creates a kind of subtle darkness where nothing advances, nothing is resolved, nothing is defined. But when the heart decides to trust, something begins to align. Not because all the answers have appeared, but because the mind begins to adjust to what really matters. Spiritual clarity doesn't come before the step. It comes after. Abraham didn't walk because he understood. He walked because he trusted. And as he went forward, the direction became clearer. That's a powerful spiritual principle. God doesn't light the whole path at once. He lights the next step. Maybe today you are exactly in that place, waiting for a complete answer, a clear sign, an absolute guarantee. But as long as this need dominates, the mind will continue to be stuck in doubt, because God does not negotiate with the need for control. He invites trust. And when this confidence begins, even if small, even with uncertainties, something changes inside the mind. The weight decreases, the pressure to understand everything disappears, and a new way of walking emerges, lighter, safer, even without all the answers. Because in the end, it's not about knowing exactly where you're going. It's about knowing who's guiding you. And when that becomes real, the confusion loses momentum, and direction starts to appear on the way. There is a prison that does not make noise, does not appear on the outside, but holds inside in a deep way. It is when the heart carries pain that has never been released. And the most difficult thing is that many times the person tries to move on, tries to forget, tries to ignore. But the mind keeps returning to the same place, as if it was stuck in something that was never resolved. Joseph lived exactly that. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wronged even when he did the right thing. He had every reason to feed pain, revolt, thoughts of revenge. And humanly speaking, it would be understandable, because when someone hurts deeply, the natural tendency of the mind is to revisit it, to create scenarios, to feed feelings that grow stronger over time. And that's where many get stuck without realizing it. Because the hurt doesn't just stay in the heart, it begins to influence thoughts. It distorts the way people see people, contaminates decisions, steals peace. And little by little, the mind fills up with negative memories, internal dialogues that never end, emotions that repeat themselves. But Joseph did something different. Instead of allowing the pain to define his mind, he chose to forgive. And that choice wasn't emotional. It was spiritual, because forgiving doesn't mean ignoring what happened or saying it didn't hurt. It means deciding not to carry it inside you anymore. And years later, when he finally finds those who have hurt him, he reveals something that shows the level of deliverance he has achieved. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. That changes everything, because Joseph didn't deny evil, but he chose to see beyond it. He allowed God to transform what was pain into purpose. And that's exactly what forgiveness does. It breaks the cycle of emotional darkness and makes room for God to reframe history. As long as there is hurt, the mind remains stuck in the past. But when forgiveness happens, something breaks. Thoughts begin to calm down, the weight decreases, freedom begins to emerge, not because the past has changed, but because it no longer has power over the present. Maybe today, there are situations that still hurt when you remember. People who marked you, moments that you can't forget. And without realizing it, this may be fueling thoughts that prevent you from moving forward. But just as it happened with Joseph, there is a path of liberation, and this path passes through a decision that, although it seems difficult, has the power to completely restore the mind. If that word has found something inside you, don't ignore that moment. Sometimes God speaks quietly but profoundly. And if you felt it, write in the comments, "I trust God." It may sound simple, but this little statement can be the beginning of a healing that your soul needs to live. There is a silent moment in life when the person realizes that they have moved away, not from a physical place, but from what gave meaning, direction, and peace. It is when the mind begins to get lost in confused thoughts, empty decisions, and a constant feeling of lack, as if something essential was absent. And the deepest thing is that many times this distance happens gradually, almost without being noticed. The prodigal son represents exactly this state. He had everything, he was close to the source, but he decided to go his own way. At first, it felt like freedom, it felt like choice, it felt like control. But over time, what seemed right began to reveal emptiness. Decisions began to weigh heavily. And that's how darkness comes in, not just through pain, but through distancing. When the connection with God weakens, the mind loses reference. It begins to seek meaning in the wrong places, begins to lean on unstable thoughts, begins to spin in circles without finding a way out. But there is a turning point in this story, a turning point that changes everything. The Bible says that he came to his senses. That is, there was an awakening. In the midst of the confusion, something cleared up. And then comes the most important decision. Rising up and went to his father, while he was yet a long way off, his father saw him. Luke 15:20. Notice this. It all starts with one step. He didn't have everything sorted out. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure how he would be received. But he decided to come back. And even before he arrived, even before he explained, even before justifying, the father was already looking, he was already waiting, he was ready to receive him. This reveals something powerful. Darkness is never the end. It can be the point where all seems lost, but it can also be the beginning of a return. Because God doesn't require perfection to welcome someone back, he responds to the first step. And when this reconnection happens, something changes deeply within the mind. Identity begins to be restored, purpose makes sense again, direction reappears. Not because everything around has changed instantly, but because the source has been refound. Maybe today there is a feeling inside you that cannot be easily explained. An emptiness, a restlessness, a longing for something that you don't even know how to describe properly. This may not only be emotional, it may be a sign that there is a reconnection waiting to happen. And the most powerful thing is to understand that no matter how far someone has gone, the way back remains open. And the first step does not require perfection, only decision. If you are here now, it is not by chance. There is something being awakened within you, something that can completely change the course of your life. So stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be exactly the answer that your mind and heart were looking for. There is a kind of restlessness that does not come from chance. It is when something inside you knows it needs to do something, but you keep postponing it. It is not a lack of capacity, it is not a lack of opportunity. It is a silent resistance that grows, creating discomfort that is difficult to explain. The mind begins to become heavy, thoughts become confused, and a constant sense of misalignment begins to dominate. Jonah lived just that. God spoke clearly, directly, without room for doubt. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh. Jonah 1:2. There was no mystery in the call, there was no confusion in the direction. But even so, he decided to flee. And here is a profound point that many ignore. Mental darkness does not always come from the absence of direction. Sometimes it comes from disobedience to the direction that has already been given. Because when someone runs away from what they know they should do, the mind comes into conflict. A heaviness arises, a restlessness, a lack of peace that is not resolved with distractions. Jonas tried to follow another path. He got on a boat, walked away from the mission, tried to convince himself that he could continue normally. But what happened? A storm began. And it wasn't just external, it was a reflection of what was already happening inside him. When there is misalignment with God, life begins to reflect this. Situations get complicated, peace disappears, and the mind enters a cycle of confusion. Not because God wants to punish, but because he is trying to awaken. And even in the middle of the flight, God did not give up on Jonah. The storm, the wind, the rough sea, it was all part of a process of bringing the mind back to the right place until Jonah finds himself in an extreme point, inside a dark, isolated, uncontrolled place. And it is exactly there that something changes, because sometimes it is at the edge that the mind finally stops resisting. It is when there is nowhere else to run that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And then awakening happens. Spiritual urgency isn't about pressure, it's about alignment. It's understanding that postponing what God has already shown only prolongs the state of darkness. Each time the voice is ignored, the confusion increases. But the moment the decision changes, everything begins to reorganize. Maybe today there is something you already know you need to do. A decision, a change, a step that you have been postponing. And while this continues to be ignored, the mind remains restless. But just like it happened with Jonas, there is always an opportunity to return. There is always a moment when the decision can be made, and when that happens, the path begins to open up again. If this message has touched something inside you, it may not be a coincidence. God knows how to reach exactly where He needs to be. And if you recognize that He has been good, even in times of correction, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of an alignment that changes everything. There's a moment when the transformation stops being just internal, and it starts to overflow outward, because when God really enlightens the mind, it is not hidden, it is not contained, it is not silent. The change becomes visible, perceptible, almost impossible to ignore, and not because the person is trying to prove something, but because something inside him has been profoundly changed. The Samaritan woman carried a history that marked her mind. Rejection, mistakes, decisions that put her on the sidelines. So much so that she avoided people, fetched water at times when no one was around. This reveals much more than a habit. It reveals a mind marked by shame, isolation, an identity built from the past. And then the meeting takes place. It was not planned by her. It was not something she consciously sought. But Jesus was there waiting. And the most impressive thing is that He did not begin with accusations nor with judgments. He began with a conversation, simple, direct, but loaded with truth. Gradually, He begins to reveal what was hidden, not to expose, but to liberate. He touches exactly on the points that shaped her mind, showing that He knew her whole story. And yet, He was there, offering something new. And that's when everything changes. Because when the truth finds a willing heart, the darkness can't remain. The confusion begins to dissipate, the shame loses strength, the identity begins to be restored. And the result of that wasn't silence. It was movement. The Bible says, "Come, see a man who told me all that I have done." John 4:29. That woman who avoided people now runs toward them. The one who hid now becomes a voice. This is not just behavior change. It's mind transformation. When God illuminates, testimony becomes inevitable. It is not an obligation, it is a consequence. Because what has been lived inside begins to manifest itself on the outside. Words change, attitudes change, the way of seeing life changes. Maybe you haven't realized it yet, but small changes may already be happening inside you. Thoughts that once dominated begin to lose strength. Sensations that were once constant begin to diminish. And that's no coincidence. It's a process. Transformation doesn't always happen explosively. Sometimes it starts silent, almost imperceptible. But when it continues, it becomes visible. And there comes a time when you look back and realize that you're no longer the same person. And the most powerful thing is to understand that God does not choose perfect people to transform. He transforms real people. with stories, with flaws, with marks, because when the light enters, it does not ignore the past. It resignifies. If you're feeling something different while listening to it, don't ignore it. It could be the very beginning of a shift that goes beyond what you imagine. And the longer you stay, the more that truth deepens. That word is not for everyone. If you are here now, there is a purpose in it. Something still needs to be revealed. Something still needs to be aligned within you. So keep going, because what comes next may touch exactly the area that you haven't even realized needs to be transformed yet. There is a moment when the person realizes that changing on the outside no longer solves. You can adjust behaviors, try to do things differently, avoid certain mistakes, but deep down, something remains misaligned. The mind still carries the weight, the conscience still accuses, and a silent feeling of distance from God remains. It is at this point that many get tired, because they realize that the problem is not only in attitudes, it is deeper. David arrived exactly at this place. After making mistakes, after trying to cover it up, after dealing with the consequences, he could have just tried to reorganize his image, adjust his outward posture, move forward as if nothing had happened. But he understood something that few understand. Without inner transformation, there is no true restoration. And then he prays a prayer that reveals the real way of change. Create in me, O God, a pure heart, and renew in me a right spirit. Psalm 51:10. Notice the depth of it. He doesn't just ask for forgiveness, he asks for reconstruction. He doesn't just ask for relief, he asks for complete transformation from the inside out. This shows that the mind is not only restored when error is acknowledged, it is restored when the heart is sincere before God. Genuine repentance is not passing guilt. It is not fear of consequences. It is a profound recognition that something needs to be changed at the root. And when that repentance really happens, something starts to move. The mind that once tried to justify starts to align with the truth. The thoughts that once defended themselves start to surrender. And that surrender doesn't weaken. It liberates. Many live trapped because they try to deal with the darkness only on the surface. They adjust attitudes, change routines, avoid situations, but they do not allow God to touch the inside. And without this deep touch, the mind continues to carry residues, marks, inclinations that sooner or later reappear. But when God begins to rebuild from within, everything changes. Purity is not just behavior, it is intention. Clarity is not just understanding, it is inner direction, and this brings a lightness that cannot be produced by human effort. David understood that it was no use looking right. He needed to be transformed, and this decision made room for God to do something new within him, not instantaneous in the superficial sense, but deep in the real sense. Maybe there is something inside you that has not yet been completely surrendered. Something that you try to solve on your own, adjust in your own way, control with your own strength. But the real change begins when that attempt ceases, and the surrender begins. Because God doesn't just work on what you show, He works on what you deliver. And when the heart truly opens, the mind begins to be restored continuously, bringing a purity that does not depend on constant effort, but on a transformation that comes from within. There is a silent trap that many do not realize when they start to seek transformation, the idea that they need to face everything alone. The mind says that it is better to isolate yourself, that no one would understand, that it is safer to deal with everything internally. And little by little, this isolation creates a dangerous space where thoughts are not confronted, emotions are not shared, and darkness finds free ground to grow. The early church lived the exact opposite of this. They understood something that goes beyond a religious concept. They understood that faith was not meant to be lived alone. The Bible describes it simply but profoundly. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. Acts 2:42. It wasn't just about learning, it was about walking together. And this completely changes the environment of the mind, because when someone is alone, their thoughts become the only reference. There is no correction, there is no balance, there is no support. And in this scenario, even a small doubt can grow, even a simple fear can become dominant. But when there is communion, something different happens. Faith is strengthened because it is shared. The vision is adjusted because there is exchange. The weight is shared because it is not carried alone. And the mind finds a kind of protection that does not exist in isolation. Think about it carefully. How many times did a thought seem much bigger when you were alone, but lost strength when it was shared? How many times has a word from someone brought clarity to something that inside your mind seemed confusing? This is no coincidence. It is the effect of communion. Spiritual unity creates an environment where light circulates, where that which is hidden can be exposed in a healthy way, where truth is constantly reinforced. And this prevents darkness from settling in or remaining. On the other hand, isolation does exactly the opposite. It silences the voice of external truth and amplifies the internal voice, which is not always aligned. And it is in this silence that many thoughts begin to gain strength, creating cycles that could be interrupted with a simple connection. God never designed a solitary walk. From the beginning, the idea has always been one of unity, of support, of joint growth, because the mind needs healthy environments to stay aligned. Maybe you've gotten used to dealing with everything on your own. Maybe you think it's easier, safer, simpler. But that choice is often fueling exactly what you want to win. And when you start connecting, sharing, walking with others who also seek the same light, something changes. The mind is strengthened, faith is strengthened, and darkness loses space. If this message has reached you, think about how many other people also need that same light right now. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you help this word reach out to lives that are facing silent battles. And just as you are being touched, others can also find direction, peace, and transformation through it. There is a silent question that crosses the minds of many people, even if it is not always said out loud. Why am I here? And when this question does not find an answer, something begins to disorganize inside. The mind becomes unstable, decisions become uncertain, and even small situations gain greater weight than they should. Lack of purpose is not just a doubt, it is a gap that opens space for confusion. Jeremiah faced something similar, but in a different way. When God calls him, his first reaction is not confidence, it is insecurity. He looks at himself, at his limitations, at what he believes he does not have. But then God responds with a truth that completely changes perspective. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Jeremiah 1:5. This reveals something profound. Purpose does not begin when you understand, nor when you feel ready. It already existed even before you were born. That is, your life is not a chance. It is not a random sequence of events. There is an intention, a direction, something that was established before everything else. And when this truth is not understood, the mind tries to fill this void in other ways. It seeks meaning in passing things, tries to find identity in external opinions, runs after paths that seem promising, but that do not sustain. And this generates an internal tiredness, a constant feeling of trying, but never arriving. But when the call begins to be understood, even if gradually, something aligns. The mind finds direction. Doubts begin to lose strength, not because all the answers have appeared, but because there is a firmer foundation. Jeremiah thought he was not capable. He questioned, resisted, tried to argue. But God did not answer with long explanations. He answered with identity. He showed that the value was not in human capacity, but in divine purpose. and that changes everything. Because often mental confusion comes from comparison, insecurity, the feeling of not being enough. But when someone understands that they have been called by God, these voices begin to lose strength. The mind stops revolving around doubts and begins to settle on a greater truth. That doesn't mean that everything becomes easy or clear right away, but it does mean that there is an axis, a point of stability. And when the mind finds that point, it doesn't get lost so easily. Maybe today you're trying to understand many things at the same time. Paths, decisions, directions. But maybe what is missing is not more information. It is connection with the purpose. Because when you begin to see your life from what God has already established, something changes within you. The confusion decreases, the clarity increases, and the mind begins to settle on something that does not depend on the circumstances. And even though there are still questions, there is a greater certainty underpinning everything. You are not lost. You are in a process of discovering what has already been defined from the beginning. There is a subtle but decisive difference between hearing sounds and recognizing a voice. Many people live surrounded by thoughts, ideas, intuitions, but they cannot identify when it is God speaking. And this is not because God is silent, but because the mind has not yet been trained to discern. Samuel started just like that, still young, without experience, without understanding how God communicated. He heard something that called his name. His first reaction was natural. He ran to Eli, thinking it was him. This happened more than once. Samuel listened, but he didn't recognize it. Notice this. The voice was present, but there was a lack of discernment. Until the time comes when he receives simple but powerful guidance, the next time he hears, he should respond differently. And then, when the voice calls again, he says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears," 1 Samuel 3:10. This is the turning point. It wasn't just listening. It was the willingness to recognize and respond. And this is exactly where many get lost. Because listening requires attention, but recognizing requires sensitivity, and responding requires surrender. God continues to speak today in the same clear, direct, and personal way. But the modern mind is full of noise, worries, distractions, haste. All of this creates an environment where God's voice even passes through, but does not find space to be perceived. And the most interesting thing is that God does not compete with noise. As with Elijah, he continues to speak in a subtle, directed, precise way, but only those who develop this listening can perceive it. Spiritual sensitivity is not born ready. It is developed. And it starts with something simple: disposition. When the mind quiets down, when the heart opens, when there is real interest in listening, something begins to change. Gradually, you begin to notice differences. Not every thought has the same weight. Not every idea has the same origin. God's voice carries a unique characteristic. It directs without confusing, corrects without destroying, leads without pressuring. Even when it confronts, it brings a peace that cannot be explained. And the more you learn to recognize this, the more your mind aligns. Samuel was not born knowing how to discern. He learned, and this learning completely changed his life. Because from that moment on, he didn't just listen, he understood. And when the mind reaches that level, the darkness loses space, because doubt begins to be replaced by direction. Maybe today you have heard something inside you, but you couldn't identify it. Maybe you ignored it, maybe you confused it with your own thoughts, but that can start to change now. The more you are willing to listen, the clearer it becomes. And when that clarity begins to emerge, the mind finds a new kind of security, not based on what it sees, but on what it internally recognizes as truth. If this message is awakening something within you, maybe it's time to express it simply. Write in the comments, "Speak up, Lord. I want to listen." Sometimes a sincere phrase makes room for a new way of perceiving God's voice in your life. There is something that the human mind deeply fears: the feeling of being in the dark, without direction, not knowing where to go. And we are not just talking about physical darkness, but that kind of inner night, where everything seems uncertain, where thoughts are confused, and the path ahead is not clear. It is in this type of scenario that many get lost, not because there is no direction, but because they cannot see. The people of Israel lived exactly that. They were in the desert, a naturally difficult, unpredictable environment, full of challenges. During the day, there was still some visual reference, but at night, everything became more intense. Darkness took over, and any wrong step could have consequences. But God didn't let them walk in the dark. The Bible reveals something powerful. The Lord went before them in a pillar of fire to give them light. Exodus 13:21. Notice this. The light didn't come from them. It didn't depend on their ability. It wasn't something they needed to produce. It was God's presence guiding, illuminating, showing the way through the darkness. And that reveals a principle that changes everything within the mind. True security is not in having all the answers, but in knowing that there is a constant presence illuminating every step. Because when the mind tries to walk on its own, it gets lost easily. But when it recognizes that it is not alone, something changes. God's presence does not fail. It does not appear only at specific moments and then disappears. It remains. The problem is that many only perceive this presence when everything is clear. But it is precisely in the darkness that it manifests itself with more intensity. How many times have you felt directionless, as if you were walking without knowing exactly where to go? And yet somehow something sustained you, something kept you going, something kept you from losing yourself completely. This is not chance, it is presence. When one lives aware of this presence, the mind becomes more stable. Anxiety decreases because it is no longer necessary to control everything. Fear loses strength because there is greater confidence. And the confusion begins to dissipate, because even if the complete path is not visible, the next step is illuminated. The pillar of fire didn't show the whole desert. It showed enough to keep walking, and this teaches something profound. God doesn't reveal everything at once, but He never lets light be lacking for the present moment. Maybe today you are in a period where not everything makes sense, where there are unanswered questions, undefined paths, difficult decisions, but that doesn't mean an absence of direction. It can just mean that you need to recognize the light that is already present. And when that awareness becomes real, the mind stops fighting the darkness and starts trusting in the light, because where God's presence is, the darkness doesn't dominate. It just reveals how much the light is needed. What you will hear now may be exactly the missing piece to complete this understanding. There is something that few realize, but that can completely change the way you see your own mind. So stay, because the next step can bring clarity that you have not yet experienced. There is a type of pain that cannot be explained with simple words. It does not only appear in the body or in the circumstances. It crosses the mind, weighs on the thoughts, and creates an inner silence that is difficult to bear. It is when everything seems to fall apart at the same time, and even what once made sense begins to lose clarity. And in this place, many believe that God has moved away. Job got exactly to that point. He lost everything he had, faced deep pain, was surrounded by unanswered questions, and, perhaps most difficult of all, experienced God's silence. And that silence, to the mind, can be one of the greatest tests, because when there is no answer, thoughts begin to create interpretations. Doubts arise, questions grow, and darkness tries to set in. But there is something in Job that stands out. Even in the midst of pain, he does not completely break his connection with God. He questions, he suffers, he expresses himself, but he does not disconnect. And this reveals a profound principle. Consolation does not mean the absence of pain, but the presence of God in the midst of it. The human mind tends to seek immediate relief. It wants quick answers, visible solutions, clear signs. But God, in many moments, works differently. He allows processes, and in these processes something begins to be molded from within. Pain, when crossed with God, does not destroy, it refines. It exposes areas that were previously hidden, reveals limits that were not perceived, and takes the mind to a level of depth that would not be reached otherwise. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because God uses even what hurts to generate something greater. And there comes a time when Job declares something that completely transforms the understanding of everything he has experienced. "I knew you only by hearing, but now my eyes see you." Job 42:5. That changes everything, because he realizes that in the midst of pain, something has been built. It wasn't just resistance, it was revelation. He came to know God in a more intimate, more real, deeper way. What was once just information has now become experience. And this is exactly what happens when the mind goes through affliction without disconnecting from God. The darkness even tries to intensify, the thoughts even get heavier. But at the same time, something begins to form inside. A clearer perception, a greater sensitivity, a deeper connection. Maybe you're in a moment where not everything makes sense, where there are pains you can't explain, questions that haven't been answered yet. But that doesn't mean God's absence. It can mean He's working on a deeper level, because true consolation is not when everything is resolved quickly. It is when, even in the midst of pain, God's presence begins to become more real than ever. And when that happens, the mind finds a kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances, but on the certainty that it is not alone in the process. There is a kind of darkness that does not present itself as an obvious error. It comes disguised as logic of correct appearance, of something that seems harmless, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous, because the mind does not reject what seems right. It accepts, absorbs, and begins to build thoughts from that. It was like that at the beginning of everything. Eve was not confronted with an absurd lie or something clearly wrong. The serpent did not come imposing darkness. It brought a distortion, a small change in the truth, a seemingly simple question but loaded with intention, and it was in this detail that everything began to change. Eva's mind began to consider something that was not part of her reality before, not because she wanted to make a mistake, but because she did not correctly discern the origin of that voice. And that is the central point. The problem was not only listening, it was not perceiving who was speaking. The Bible warns about this directly. "But I fear that as the serpent deceived Eve with his craftiness, so your senses will also be corrupted." 2 Corinthians 11:3. That is, deception does not happen abruptly. It happens subtly, almost imperceptibly. And this continues to happen today. Thoughts arise with the appearance of truth. Ideas seem to make sense. Feelings seem to justify decisions. But not everything that seems right comes from God. And when the mind is not aligned with the truth, it becomes vulnerable to these distortions. The most dangerous thing is that deception does not present itself as a complete lie. It mixes truth with error. It makes small changes perspectives, creates doubts where there was once certainty. And when this is not perceived, the mind begins to move away from the light without even realizing it. That is why spiritual discernment becomes essential. Not as something complex, but as a developed sensitivity. It is the ability to perceive the difference between what comes from God and what only seems to come from Him. And this is only possible when the truth is already deeply established within the mind. The more someone knows the truth, the less room there is for deception, because the lie may even try to get closer, but it does not find a basis to sustain itself. The mind that is firm in the truth quickly recognizes what is not aligned. Perhaps you have experienced moments when something seemed right at first, but then revealed consequences that did not make sense. This happens when discernment is not active, and it is not an irreversible failure. It is a sign that something needs to be adjusted, because God doesn't just speak, He also teaches discernment. He strengthens the mind so that it is not carried away by any voice, by any idea, by any momentary sensation. And when that begins to happen, the disguised darkness loses its power. If while you were listening to this something came to your heart, maybe it's a sign that there is something that needs prayer, something that you need to present to God with sincerity. If you feel this, write your prayer request in the comments. It can be simple, it can be direct, but make it a moment of connection. Because when the truth finds an open heart, the deception loses space, and the light begins to settle more firmly. There is a moment in the journey when the mind even wants to trust, but still carries insecurities that are difficult to ignore. It's not a lack of faith, it's a mixture of doubt with hope, of willingness to move forward with fear of making mistakes. And at this point, many are paralyzed, waiting for an absolute certainty that rarely comes in a complete way. Gideon was exactly like that. When God called him, he didn't see himself as someone prepared, nor as someone capable. On the contrary, his first reaction was to question, doubt, seek confirmation. And this reveals something very human. The mind needs security to take greater steps. Then Gideon does something that many, in silence, also do. He asks for a sign. If you will deliver Israel by my hand, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. Judges 6:36-37. He lays down a condition, a test, something specific that could confirm what God had already said. And the most impressive thing is not the request, it's the answer. God in His mercy answers, not because Gideon was right to doubt, but because God knows the frailty of the human mind. He understands the process. He knows that sometimes faith needs to be strengthened step by step. But here, there is a very important point. The sign was not what defined the call. The call was already established. The sign came as confirmation, not as a basis. And this is exactly where many get confused, because there is a difference between recognizing signs and becoming dependent on them. The mind that is being enlightened learns to perceive when God is confirming something. But it does not live trapped in the constant need for proof. God communicates in specific ways, sometimes through situations, through words, through internal impressions, through confirmations that are repeated in a clear way. And when the mind begins to perceive this, a different security arises, not based on control, but on sensitivity. Gideon, after receiving the confirmations, did not keep asking for new signs all the time. He moved forward, because the purpose of the sign was not to create dependence. It was to generate enough trust to take the next step. Perhaps you have experienced moments when something has been confirmed very clearly, a direction that has been repeated, a door that has opened, a word that has fit exactly what you needed. But even so, the mind can continue to ask for more, as if it were never enough. And that's when spiritual maturity begins to form. When you recognize that God has already spoken, has already confirmed, has already directed, and now the next step is to trust. Mental darkness often feeds on constant indecision, on the need to have infinite guarantees before acting. But light manifests when there is a willingness to move forward based on what has already been revealed. God doesn't ignore your need for security, but He also doesn't allow you to get stuck in it. He confirms, strengthens, sustains. But he always leads forward, and when the mind begins to understand this, it becomes firmer, not because it has all the answers, but because it recognizes the signs without losing focus on the direction. There is a level of darkness that tries to dominate through fear. It is not just an isolated thought, it is a constant pressure, a sense of threat that makes the mind imagine scenarios, anticipate losses, create insecurities. And when fear finds space, it begins to govern decisions, hinder attitudes, and weaken trust. Daniel faced exactly this kind of situation. He was not facing a small problem, nor an ordinary difficulty. He was facing death. A law was created to force him to turn away from God, and the consequence of disobedience would be to be thrown into the lion's den. There was no logical way out. There was no comfortable alternative. There was no way around the situation. And yet, Daniel didn't trade his faith. He didn't adjust his posture out of fear. He didn't change his practice to protect himself. He didn't allow the threat to control his mind. He kept doing what he always did, praying, trusting, standing firm. Now think about it. The fear was present, the threat was real, the risk was concrete. But Daniel's mind did not bow. And this reveals something profound. True faith is not the absence of fear. It is the decision not to allow fear to rule. When Daniel was thrown into the pit, everything pointed to the end. The atmosphere was one of darkness, danger, impossibility. But something invisible was happening there. Something that could not be seen with the eyes, but that completely changed reality. And the next day, Daniel's statement reveals this in a powerful way. My God sent his angel, and he shuts the mouths of lions. Daniel 6:22. Notice the power of that. The lions haven't disappeared. The environment hasn't changed, but God's power has neutralized that which posed a threat. And that teaches something essential to the mind. Faith doesn't necessarily eliminate circumstances. It changes the effect they have on you. Often, mental darkness grows because the person believes that he will only have peace when everything is resolved. But Daniel shows the opposite. Peace comes from trust, not control. It comes from the certainty that God is present, even when the scenario does not change immediately. The mind that learns to trust in this way becomes unshakable. Not because it never faces problems, but because it does not surrender to them. Fear may even try to enter, but it does not find space to dominate. Doubt may even appear, but it does not settle. Perhaps today there are situations that seem too big, too difficult, too scary. But just like Daniel, there is a greater reality operating beyond what meets the eye. And when this truth begins to take hold within the mind, something changes. The posture changes, the way of thinking changes, the way of reacting changes. Because now it is no longer fear that leads, it is faith. If this message has found you deeply, it may not be by chance. There is something being strengthened within you now. And if in your heart there is this certainty beginning to be born, write in the comments, God chose me. Because recognizing this can be the first step to living with a faith that does not shake, even in the face of the greatest pressures. There is a time in life when the mind begins to be tested by waiting. It's no longer about starting or about taking the first step. It's about continuing to believe when nothing seems to be happening, and it's in this interval between promise and fulfillment that many get lost, because silence, delay, and the absence of visible signs begin to generate doubts that, little by little, try to weaken trust. Sarah lived exactly this process. She received a clear promise from God, something that seemed impossible from the beginning. Time passed, the years advanced, and what was already improbable became, humanly speaking, unattainable. Logic said it would not happen. The body said it was no longer possible. Circumstances reinforced the doubt, And this is exactly how the darkness tries to act in the mind, not by directly denying the promise, but by making it seem too distant, too slow, too improbable. Thoughts begin to arise. Will it still happen? Have I misunderstood? Has the time passed? And when these ideas gain space, faith begins to be pressured. But there is a question that completely breaks this human logic. Is anything difficult for the Lord? Genesis 18:14. This question is not just rhetorical. It is a direct confrontation with the limitation of the mind. Because while the mind tries to measure possibilities, God works in a dimension where the impossible does not exist. Sarah, at one point, even laughed. She laughed because it seemed absurd, distant, out of reality, and this shows how much the mind can be influenced by what it sees and feels. But what she still didn't realize was that the promise didn't depend on the circumstances. It depended on the one who promised. And when the right time came, what seemed impossible became reality. Not because Sarah found a way, not because conditions naturally changed, but because God fulfilled what he had said. This reveals something powerful to the mind. God's promises are an anchor. They keep the mind steady when everything around seems unstable. They keep doubt from taking a person away. They sustain even when there is no immediate evidence. The mind that clings to the promise is not easily lost, because even in the midst of waiting, there is a basis. There is a certainty that does not depend on time or circumstances, and this brings a kind of stability that cannot be explained by logic alone. Maybe today you are in a moment of waiting, something that was promised, something that you believe, but that has not yet happened. And as time passes, the mind tries to question, tries to doubt, tries to weaken what was once clear. But this story shows that time does not nullify the promise. Delay does not cancel out what God has said. And what seems impossible remains entirely possible in his hands. Perhaps you have been waiting for an answer for a long time, and this message did not arrive by chance. Stay until the end, because there is something deeper being revealed, something that can strengthen your mind exactly in this moment of waiting. There is a type of fatigue that does not come only from the body. It comes from the soul. It is when the person looks around and everything seems in ruins. Plans that did not work out, paths that closed, losses that left deep marks. And in this scenario, the mind begins to wear out, trying to find meaning where everything seems broken. Jeremiah lived exactly that. He wasn't watching from afar. He was in the midst of destruction. Jerusalem had been devastated. The people were suffering, and everything that had once been security was now just a memory. Humanly, there was no reason for hope. Everything pointed to the end. And it is in this scenario that something surprising happens. In the midst of lamentations, in the midst of pain, in the midst of what seemed irreversible, Jeremiah makes a statement that is not born of circumstances, but of something deeper. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed. They are renewed every morning. Lamentations 3:22-23. Notice this. Nothing around him had changed. The ruins were still there. The pain still existed, but the way he saw began to transform, because the hope he accessed didn't come from what he saw. It came from who God is. And this completely changes the way the mind reacts in difficult times. When hope is based on circumstances, any external change can shake everything. But when it is based on the nature of God, it remains, even when everything seems unstable. The weary mind needs that. It needs a source that doesn't waver, that doesn't fail, that doesn't depend on the moment. And that's exactly what Jeremiah found. He realized that, despite everything, there was something that remained constant: God's faithfulness. Each morning brought a new opportunity, not because the situation had changed, but because God's mercy was renewed. And that brings a kind of quiet but powerful strength. the mind begins to rise, even if slowly. The weight begins to lessen, even if gradually. Maybe today you are looking around and seeing areas of your life that seem to have fallen apart. Situations that didn't happen as you expected. Moments that left marks that are difficult to erase. And this may be affecting the way you think, how you feel, how you see the future. But just like Jeremiah, there is a hope that does not depend on the scenario. There is a faithfulness that has not been shaken by what has happened. And when the mind begins to connect with that, something changes, not instantly all around, but deep within you. Hope begins to be renewed, not because everything is perfect, but because God remains who He has always been. And this is enough to sustain the mind, even in the most difficult moments. If this message has reached you, perhaps it is a sign that God is renewing something within you now. And if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen your mind and your faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what starts here can continue to grow with each new message. There is a battle that takes place in silence, without witnesses, without external signs, but that completely defines a person's life. It is the battle of thoughts. And the most dangerous thing is that many times it does not start with something clearly wrong. It starts with subtle suggestions, ideas that seem reasonable, paths that seem to make sense in the moment. Jesus faced exactly this kind of attack in the desert. He was not confronted with ordinary situations. He was confronted directly in his mind. Each temptation was, in fact, a proposal, a suggestion to act outside God's time, to prove something, to take a shortcut. And all this was accompanied by logic, arguments, a convincing appearance. And that's exactly how destructive thoughts operate. They don't come in saying they're wrong. They come in trying to convince. They try to make it seem like they're necessary, urgent, justifiable. And when the mind isn't prepared, it starts to dialogue with those thoughts, to consider possibilities, to make room. But what Jesus does is completely different. He doesn't debate. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't enter into prolonged dialogue. He responds with authority. And that authority doesn't come from opinion. It comes from the Word. It is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4. Notice this. Each attack received a direct response, based on truth. Jesus did not react emotionally, did not respond with feeling, did not try to reason with human logic. He used something stronger, firmer, more definitive. This reveals an essential principle for the mind. Thoughts are not overcome with willpower alone. They are overcome with truth. Because when a wrong thought meets a mind empty of truth, it settles in. But when it finds a mind grounded in the Word, it is confronted immediately. Many people try to ignore negative thoughts, try to run away from them, try to distract themselves. But that doesn't solve it. Because the thought is still there, waiting for space. What transforms the mind is learning to respond. And to answer is not to repeat meaningless phrases. It is to declare that which is in line with God. It is to bring to mind what is true, what is firm, what does not change. And when this happens, something changes in the internal structure. The mind begins to gain strength. The thoughts that once dominated begin to lose authority, not because they have completely disappeared, but because they no longer find room to settle down. Jesus showed that spiritual victory is not in avoiding the battle. It is in knowing how to face it. And this victory does not depend on external circumstances, but on the way the mind reacts to what it tries to enter. Perhaps today there are thoughts that come back often, ideas that try to repeat themselves, inner voices that try to weaken your confidence. But just like in the desert, there is an answer for each of them. And when you learn to respond with the truth, something powerful happens. Darkness finds no place anymore. because the light of the Word doesn't just illuminate, it establishes authority within the mind. There is a moment when the mind is faced with something greater than it can solve on its own, no matter how much you think, how much you try to find a way out. There are situations that require more than strategy, more than human effort, and it is exactly at this point that many feel pressured, insecure, even paralyzed, because they do not know how to act. Esther experienced this kind of pressure. She was not just dealing with a personal decision, she was facing a scenario that involved the lives of an entire people. The risk was real, the danger was imminent, and any wrong choice could have irreversible consequences. The mind, in this type of situation, tends to be filled with fear, doubts, negative scenarios, but before acting, Esther did something that completely changes the way she deals with the problem. She didn't make an impulsive decision. She didn't let herself be carried away by pressure. She didn't try to solve everything with her own ability alone. She sought God. Go, gather all the Jews, and fast for me. Esther 4:16. Notice the depth of this. Before the action, there was alignment. Before the decision, there was surrender. Before facing the external, she strengthened the internal, and this reveals a powerful principle. Intercession doesn't just change what's around, it transforms what's inside. When one enters a place of deep prayer, something begins to happen in the mind. Fear begins to lose strength, confusion begins to dissipate, clarity begins to emerge. Not because the problem has disappeared, but because the mind is now connected to a greater source. Fasting and prayer were not just rituals, they were tools of alignment. Esther needed courage. She needed direction. She needed peace to make a decision that could cost her own life. And that strength didn't come from within her. It came from connecting with God. Often, the mind wears itself out, trying to solve everything on its own, thinking too much, analyzing too much, carrying a weight that it was not made to carry, and the more you try to control, the more you get tired, the more you get confused. But when intercession comes in, something changes. The mind ceases to be the center and is led. The pressure decreases because the responsibility is shared with God. Courage appears, not as the absence of fear, but as the presence of trust. Esther came out of that moment of prayer different, not because the external scenario had changed immediately, but because she had changed inside. Now there was firmness, clarity, direction, and that made all the difference in what came after. Maybe today there is something in front of you that seems too big, too heavy, too difficult to solve. And maybe your mind is trying to find answers without stopping, without rest. But there is a path that does not depend only on your effort. When you decide to stop, to seek, to align, something begins to reorganize. Because there are battles that are not won with action alone. They are won with spiritual positioning. Few people will understand the depth of this, but if you have made it this far, there is a reason. Something is being prepared within you. Something is being strengthened beyond what you can see now. So keep going, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what your mind needs to reach a new level of clarity and strength. There are prisons that cannot be seen with the eyes, but are felt every day in the mind. Invisible chains that limit thoughts, block decisions, and prevent advances. The person even tries to move forward, even wants to change, but something seems to hold him, as if there were a silent force keeping everything in the same place. Pedro knew this kind of prison literally, but what happened to him revealed something much deeper. He was chained, guarded by soldiers, with no human possibility of escape. Everything around him confirmed that there was no way out. Any attempt would be futile. And at that moment, the external scenario reflected exactly what many minds live internally, total limitation. But something was happening beyond what the eye could see. While Peter was imprisoned, there was a spiritual movement being generated. The church was praying, interceding, creating an environment where the impossible began to become possible. And that's where everything changes. The Bible describes the moment directly, and behold, the angel of the Lord came. And the chains fell out of his hand, Acts 12:7. Notice the power of this. The chains were not opened by human effort. They were not broken by strategy. They were not removed by trying. They simply fell off. This reveals a powerful principle. There are chains that only God can break, no matter how hard someone tries, no matter how hard they fight. Some prisons are spiritual, and they need divine intervention. How many times does the mind try to free itself from repetitive thoughts, negative patterns, feelings that don't seem to come out? The person tries to change, tries to control, tries to resist, but remains stuck. This happens because not every prison is solved with effort. Some are broken with power, and when God acts, He does not depend on natural limitations. He enters where no one can enter, does what no one can do, breaks what seemed definitive. And the most impressive thing is that many times the person does not even immediately realize what is happening. Peter at first thought he was seeing a vision. He didn't fully believe that it was real. And this also happens in the mind. When God begins to liberate, sometimes it seems strange, different, even difficult to believe. But freedom begins to manifest itself. Doors that seemed closed open, paths that seemed blocked begin to emerge, and what you once held loses strength. Not because the person has become stronger, but because God has intervened. Maybe today there are areas of your mind that seem stuck, thoughts that repeat themselves, feelings that don't change, boundaries that you've tried to break in various ways. But this story shows that there is a level of liberation that goes beyond the natural. When God decides to act, the chains do not hold, and what seemed permanent begins to fall. The mind begins to experience a freedom that does not come from effort. It comes from divine intervention, and even if it's not fully visible yet, something may already be starting to move now. Because when the light comes in, even the deepest prisons begin to lose their strength. There is a level of transformation that goes beyond changing thoughts. It is when the very presence of God begins to mark the mind in such a deep way that nothing else remains the same. It is not just understanding, it is not just feeling, it is being completely impacted by something that redefines everything inside. Moses lived it out in a visible way. He went up into the mountain, entered the presence of God, stood there at a level of intimacy that few have experienced, and when he came down, something had changed, not just inside him, but outside as well. The Bible describes the skin of his face shone after he had spoken with God. Exodus 34:29. Notice the depth of it. He didn't try to reflect light. He didn't make an effort to look different. The transformation was a direct consequence of the presence. This reveals a powerful principle. Those who truly enter the presence of God do not leave the same way. And this is not limited to the physical aspect. It happens mainly in the mind. When someone is exposed to the glory of God, thoughts begin to change. What once seemed confusing becomes clear. What once generated fear begins to lose strength. What once dominated no longer finds space. God's light doesn't just illuminate dark areas. It transforms the internal structure. It's as if something is rearranged, aligned, restored to a level that can't be produced by human effort. Many people seek change by trying to adjust behaviors, controlling thoughts, creating strategies. But there is a deeper level, where transformation is not built, it is received, and this happens in presence. Moses didn't come down with theories, he didn't come down with complex explanations. He came down differently, and everyone around noticed. This shows that true transformation doesn't need to be announced. It manifests itself. When the mind is touched by the glory of God, something irreversible happens. It doesn't mean that there will never be challenges again, but it does mean that there is a mark, an internal reference that does not disappear, a light that continues to influence thoughts, decisions, perceptions. Maybe you're looking for answers, trying to understand how to change certain areas of your mind, how to overcome patterns, how to find clarity. But there's a path that goes beyond effort. It's continuous exposure to God's presence. And the more this exposure happens, the more the transformation becomes natural, not forced, not heavy, but real. The mind begins to reflect what it is receiving. And just like Moses, even without fully realizing it, you begin to carry something different. And the strongest thing is that this light is not limited to you. It reaches others. People notice, environments are impacted, decisions are influenced. Because when God transforms, He doesn't do it halfway. If this message is bringing clarity to you, don't let it go unnoticed. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Sometimes declaring this is the beginning of a transformation that goes beyond what you can imagine right now. There is a moment when the mind needs to stop just reacting and start taking a stand. Because while the person lives reacting to fear, doubt, and confusion, he continues to be led by what he feels. But when he understands spiritual authority, something changes profoundly. He stops being dominated and starts to govern what happens inside him. The Roman centurion understood this in a way that surprised even Jesus. He was not part of the people of Israel. He did not grow up listening to the scriptures like the others, but he understood a principle that many who were close to him had not realized. He knew that authority does not depend on physical presence. It depends on position and word. When his servant was sick, he didn't ask Jesus to come to his house. He said something that reveals a rare level of understanding. "Say just one word, and my servant will be healed." Matthew 8:8. He recognized that all it took was a command, a release of authority for reality to be transformed. This completely changes the way we see the mind, because many think that they need to feel something different in order to change. They wait for peace to calm down. They wait for confidence to act. They wait for the absence of fear to move forward. But spiritual authority works in another way. It does not wait for change. It releases change. The centurion explained this clearly. He said that he was also under authority and had soldiers under his command. When he gave an order, it was carried out. There was no discussion, there was no negotiation, and he understood that with Jesus, he was even more powerful. And that's exactly how it works in the mind when one understands who one is in God. Fearful thoughts may arise, but they don't have to be accepted. Doubts may appear, but they don't have to remain. Confusion may try to creep in, but it doesn't have to settle in. Because there is an authority available, not based on human strength, but on spiritual truth. And when that authority is exercised, the mind begins to align, not automatically but intentionally. Instead of accepting everything that comes, the person begins to confront. Instead of surrendering to what he feels, he begins to declare what he knows. Instead of being carried away by thoughts, he begins to direct them. This is not ignoring reality. It is establishing a higher reality. It is understanding that not everything that passes through the mind has the right to remain, and that there is power in the word released with faith. The centurion didn't see the miracle happening, but he trusted that the word was enough. And it's that level of trust that transforms the mind, not depending on what you see or feel, but on what's true. Maybe you've gotten used to accepting certain thoughts as if you have no choice, as if it's normal to live like this. But when you understand authority, you realize that you don't have to live hostage anymore. The mind begins to find order when there is positioning, and that positioning does not come from effort. It comes from the awareness that there is a greater truth that governs everything. There is a peace that makes no sense to human logic. It does not depend on the environment. It does not depend on what is happening around us. It does not depend on immediate responses. It is a peace that appears just when everything would indicate otherwise, and that is why many cannot understand it, because they try to explain it with the natural mind. Paul was in prison when he wrote about it. It was not a comfortable situation. There was no freedom. There were no outward signs of tranquility. Humanly, this was a perfect scenario for anxiety, fear, frustration. But what he releases in his words reveals something completely different. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:7. Notice the depth of it. This peace exceeds understanding. That is, it cannot be explained by logic. It cannot be produced by circumstances. It cannot be built by mental effort. It comes from a deeper place, from a direct connection with God. This reveals something essential to the mind. It is possible to be in a dark environment and still remain in light inside, because true peace is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of God sustaining the mind in the midst of them. Many people are always trying to organize everything around them to find peace. They want to solve all pending issues, eliminate all uncertainties, ensure that nothing gets out of control. But this search never ends, because there will always be something out of place. Paul shows the opposite. Even without external control, he experienced an internal stability. And this is only possible when the mind stops depending on circumstances and starts depending on presence. This peace works as a protection. The word itself says that it guards the heart and mind. This means that even when anxious thoughts try to enter, they encounter a barrier. Even when fear tries to get closer, it cannot establish itself. Not because the person never feels anything again, but because there is something greater governing from within. A security that does not come from external guarantees, but from trust in God. Perhaps you have experienced moments when everything seemed out of control, but somehow an inexplicable peace sustained you. A tranquility that made no sense, but was there. This was not chance, it was this peace operating. And the most powerful thing is to understand that it is not only available at specific times, it can be accessed continuously. Not as a passing feeling, but as a state of connection. When the mind begins to live at this level, something changes profoundly. Anxiety loses strength, fear ceases to dominate, and the internal pressure decreases. Not because life has become perfect, but because the foundation has changed. God's peace doesn't eliminate challenges, but it prevents them from dominating the mind. And when that truth becomes real, the darkness no longer finds room to grow, because there is a constant light guarding everything inside. There is a kind of darkness that does not come from the outside. It comes from within, through a constant sadness that steals energy, weakens thoughts, and makes everything seem heavier than it really is. It is as if the mind loses strength little by little, as if each day requires more effort to continue. And in this state, many people believe that they need to solve everything first and then feel better. But Nehemiah reveals something completely different. The people were rebuilding, surrounded by challenges, facing opposition, dealing with memories of what was destroyed. It wasn't a light scenario. It wasn't an easy time. Yet, in the middle of this process, one statement changes everything. The joy of the Lord is your strength. Nehemiah 8:10. Notice this carefully. The strength did not come when everything was ready. The strength came in the middle of the reconstruction, and it did not come from strategies nor from favorable conditions. It came from the joy that originates in God. This completely breaks human logic. because normally the person thinks that joy is a consequence, something that arises when everything is fine. But here, joy is presented as a source, as something that sustains, that strengthens, that keeps the mind steady even when the scenario has not yet changed. Prolonged sadness weakens the mind. It makes thoughts lose clarity, takes away motivation, increases the feeling of heaviness. And when this sets in, the person begins to see everything through a darker lens. But spiritual joy works differently. It does not ignore reality, but it shines a light on it. It does not deny challenges, but strengthens the way of facing them. And this generates resistance. The mind that accesses this joy does not become naive. It becomes strengthened. Even in the face of difficulties, there is an inner energy that sustains, a disposition that does not depend on circumstances, a strength that comes from a deeper connection. Nehemiah didn't tell the people to ignore the situation. He directed the focus, because when the mind connects with what God is doing, instead of just looking at what is still missing, something changes. The perspective changes, and when the perspective changes, the strength comes back. Maybe you're in a moment where everything seems to demand more than you have, where the mind feels tired, overwhelmed, without the energy to keep going. But that doesn't mean the strength is gone. It could mean that the source needs to be accessed. The joy of the Lord is not a superficial feeling, it is a spiritual force. And when it begins to fill the mind, the emotional darkness loses space. Not because everything has been resolved, but because there is now something sustaining you inside. In the next few minutes, something even deeper will be revealed. There is a key that connects all of this in a practical way, something that can change the way you face each day from now on. So stay, because what comes next may be just what your mind needs to truly strengthen itself. There are two invisible states that completely shape the mind, and often the person does not even realize which one he is in. One closes, hardens, resists, the other opens, learns, transforms. Jesus revealed this in a simple but deeply confrontational way when he tells the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The two were in the same place, doing the same external practice, but with completely different internal realities. The Pharisee prayed with beautiful words full of security, highlighting his own qualities. His mind was convinced that he was already well, that he did not need to change, that he was above others. And this is exactly how pride manifests itself, in a subtle way, often even disguised as spirituality. On the other hand, the tax collector could not even lift his eyes. He recognized his condition, felt the weight of what needed to be transformed, and simply said, "Have mercy on me." There was no appearance, there was no attempt to impress. There was truth. And then comes the statement that changes everything. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Luke 18:14. This reveals a principle that directly impacts the mind. Pride closes. It prevents the person from seeing, from recognizing, from growing. It creates an invisible barrier where the light does not enter because the person believes that he already knows, that he is already well, that he does not need anything more than what he already has. Humility, on the other hand, does the opposite. It makes room. It allows the truth to enter, for God to act, for transformation to begin. Because when someone recognizes that they need it, something powerful happens. Resistance decreases, the mind becomes teachable, the heart becomes accessible. Many remain trapped in mental cycles because they never reach that point of surrender. They try to solve everything on their own. They rely only on their own strength. They resist recognizing their limitations, and all the while the mind remains in the same place, revolving around the same thoughts. But when humility comes in, the process changes. It's not about diminishing yourself. It's about standing rightly before God. It's understanding that there is something bigger, deeper, truer than what the mind can produce on its own. And it is exactly in this place that the transformation begins, not when the person proves that he is strong, but when he recognizes that he needs God, not when he tries to control everything, but when he surrenders to what needs to be done inside. Perhaps there are areas of your mind that have not yet been completely transformed, not because it is impossible, but because they have not yet been fully surrendered. And that does not require perfection. It requires sincerity, because God doesn't respond to appearance. He responds to the heart. And when that heart truly opens, the light begins to come in, bringing clarity, adjustment, renewal. The mind that humbles itself does not weaken. It positions itself to receive. And it is in this place that darkness begins to lose space, giving way to a transformation that does not come from outside, but is born from within. There is a constant tension within the mind when it tries to understand everything before acting. It is as if it needs guarantees, complete explanations, absolute security. And while this does not happen, it remains still, analyzing, questioning, spinning in circles. And the more it thinks, the more confused it becomes. Noah was called to live something completely outside of this logic. God gave him a clear instruction, but he did not detail each step of what would come. He did not explain how the impact would be. He did not show the final result in full detail. He only gave a direction, and in view of this, Noah made a decision that changes everything. So did Noah. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. Genesis 6:22. Notice the simplicity of this. He did. There is no record of long questioning, nor of attempts to adapt the order to his own logic. He just obeyed, and this obedience generated something that many seek, but few achieve: clarity. Because the mind that obeys begins to align, while the mind that resists remains confused, divided, overwhelmed. Confusion often does not come from a lack of direction. It comes from a lack of response to the direction that has already been given. Noah was building something that, for many around, didn't make sense. He probably faced external doubts, contrary opinions, questioning looks. But internally, there was an alignment, and this alignment sustained every step. Obedience creates a flow. Each step taken makes room for the next. Each aligned decision generates more direction, and so the mind stops living locked in the need to understand everything and starts living in movement, guided by what has already been revealed. Many expect to feel certain to act, but the truth is that certainty is strengthened on the way, not before. Obedience does not require total understanding. It requires enough confidence to take the next step. And it is exactly in this process that mental darkness loses strength. Because doubt needs stagnation to grow. But when there is action based on what God has already said, doubt begins to lose space. Noah didn't build the ark in a day. It was an ongoing process, sustained by an initial decision that was repeated every day: to obey. And this shows that clarity doesn't just come from a moment. It comes from a constancy. Perhaps today you're waiting to understand more in order to act, hoping to feel more secure to decide, waiting for a more favorable scenario to move forward. But it may be that the direction has already been given. And what is missing is no longer an answer, it is movement. When the mind decides to obey, even without all the details, something aligns. The weight decreases, the confusion dissolves, and a new way of walking begins to emerge. Not based on control, but on trust. And it is in this place that the mind finds something that once seemed distant, a clarity that comes not from knowing everything, but from being on the right path. There is a silent form of darkness that settles in the mind, not through direct fear, nor through evident doubt, but through the distorted perception of reality. It is when the person begins to see only what is missing, only what has not worked, only what seems insufficient. And little by little, the mind enters a state of scarcity, where nothing seems to be enough. It was exactly in this kind of scenario that Jesus found himself in front of the crowd. There were thousands of people, the need was great, and the resources were minimal, only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Humanly, that was insignificant, unable to solve the problem. Logic pointed to limitation, but before any action, before any visible miracle, Jesus does something that completely changes the environment. And when he took the 5 loaves, he gave thanks. Matthew 14:19. Notice this deeply. He thanked before the multiplication, not after. This reveals a principle that transforms the mind. Gratitude is not a response to the miracle. It is a path to it. The mind that lives focused on scarcity closes itself. It limits, reduces, blocks possibilities. Everything starts to be analyzed for what is missing, for what is not enough, for what does not meet expectations. And this generates a cycle where darkness grows because vision is limited. But gratitude does the opposite. It opens, it expands, it shifts focus. Instead of looking only at what is missing, it begins to recognize what already exists. And this simple adjustment of perception creates space for something greater to happen. Jesus didn't ignore reality, but he didn't hold on to it either. He saw beyond. And that vision didn't come from logical analysis, but from a connection with God. Gratitude aligned his mind with what heaven was already ready to do. And then the miracle happens. The little becomes enough. The limited expands. The impossible manifests. But it all started with an inner posture, a mind that chose to thank before it saw. This teaches you something essential. The way you see what you have today directly influences what can happen tomorrow. When the mind is attached to lack, it limits itself. But when it recognizes what it has already received, it opens up to what may yet come. Maybe today you are looking at your life and seeing only what has not yet arrived, what has not yet changed, what seems small compared to what you need. But this story reveals that transformation begins before external change. It begins in the way you perceive it. Gratitude doesn't negate reality, it illuminates reality. It brings light where before there was only limitation. And when that light comes in, something starts moving, not just around, but within. The grateful mind becomes lighter, more open, more sensitive to God's action. And it is in this environment that the supernatural finds space to manifest itself. By the end of this video, you can experience something that goes beyond words, something that directly touches your mind and your heart. So stay, because what's being built here can become a real turning point in how you view your life from now on. There is a point in the journey when the biggest battle is not against the problem itself. It is against the will to give up. The mind starts firm, full of faith, full of expectation, but when time passes, when the answers do not arrive at the expected pace, something begins to weaken inside. Thoughts such as, "It won't happen," "There's no point in continuing," begin to arise silently. And it is exactly at this moment that perseverance becomes a powerful spiritual force. Jesus told the story of a widow who faced an unjust situation. She needed an answer, she needed a solution, she needed justice. But the scenario was not favorable. The judge did not care. He had no interest in helping her. There was no natural motivation for something to change. Still, she continued. She insisted. She came back. She asked again and again and again, not because she had guarantees, but because she decided not to stop. And then Jesus reveals the principle behind it. And will not God avenge his elect who cry out to him day and night? Luke 18:7. Notice what is being taught here. It's not just about asking, it's about staying. It's about continuing even when there are no immediate signs, because perseverance is not empty repetition, it's positioning. The mind that perseveres does not easily surrender to darkness, because it is not based only on what it sees, but on what it believes, and this creates an inner resistance against discouragement. Many give up not because they couldn't achieve it, but because they stopped before the right moment. Mental darkness often tries to convince the person that it's no longer worth continuing, that they've tried hard enough, that it's better to accept the situation. And when this idea is accepted, the process is interrupted. But perseverance breaks this cycle. It keeps the mind active, firm, aligned. Even when everything seems to stop, something keeps happening inside. Faith is not extinguished. Hope is not extinguished. The connection with God remains alive. And this strengthens the mind, because every time you decide to continue, even without seeing immediate results, you are building something within yourself. A resistance that prevents doubt from dominating, a firmness that sustains you in the midst of the process. The widow had no power, no influence, no advantages, but she had constancy, and that was what changed everything, because her insistence created a movement that could not be ignored. Maybe today you are exactly at that point. Tired of trying, tired of waiting, tired of believing without seeing. But this message reveals that it is not over yet. As long as there is perseverance, there is a path. The light does not always appear at the first moment, but it manifests itself to those who remain. And when this happens, everything that seemed time-consuming begins to make sense. If that word found you at the right time, it might be time to respond to it in faith. Write in the comments, "Lord, I believe." Sometimes a simple decision to keep going is what paves the way for what you haven't yet been able to see. After everything that has been revealed so far, it is impossible to continue thinking the same way. When the mind decides to stay, insist, and not surrender, something begins to align within it. Perseverance opens the way, strengthens the interior, and prepares the heart for a deeper encounter with God. And that is exactly what this moment represents, not just another step, but a transition to something alive, real, and transformative. The Word confirms this direct access, this open invitation that has never been closed. "Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will show you great and sure things which you do not know." Jeremiah 33:3. Now it's no longer about learning, it's about surrendering. It's no longer about listening, it's about standing before God. There is something that only happens when the mind quiets down and the heart truly opens. This is the time to approach, to let go of everything that weighs, everything that confuses, everything that still tries to resist, and simply place it before Him. Let's pray together, trusting that God is present now, listening to every thought, every silence, and every need of your heart. Beloved Father, your word declares that you are my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Psalm 27:1. And it is with this truth that we now approach, recognizing that there is no darkness that can resist your presence. At this moment, every mind that accompanies this prayer stands before you, open, available, and thirsty for transformation. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far. Thank you that your truth reaches deep places that no one else can touch. Thank you that even when we don't realize it, you are at work, illuminating thoughts, bringing clarity, and restoring the inside. Your word sustains us, your presence envelops us, and your love leads us faithfully. Now, Father, we cry out for strength, wisdom, and direction. May each person receive discernment to recognize your voice, courage to obey your call, and faith to stand firm, even when everything seems uncertain. Strengthen the weary mind, lift up the one who is downcast, and completely renew the interior of those who no longer knew how to continue. Lord, visit each specific need now. Touch those facing emotional battles, bringing healing to old wounds and peace to agitated thoughts. Reach out to those who are struggling financially, opening pathways and bringing provision. Restore families that are divided, bringing reconciliation, love, and understanding. Extend your hand over the sick, bringing healing, relief, and complete restoration. At this moment, in silence, each heart presents before you what has not yet been said in words, every pain, every request, every need. Father, we surrender everything into your hands. We surrender our fears, our doubts, our deepest thoughts, and even what we cannot explain. We trust that you are in control of all things, and that your plan is perfect, even when we cannot fully see it. Holy Spirit, now invade every mind. Remove all lies, all confusion, all invisible oppression. Establish thy truth as an unshakable foundation. May all anxiety be replaced by thy peace, all fear by thy presence, all doubt by thy certainty. May there be light where there was darkness, liberty where there was prison, and direction where there was confusion. We declare that no darkness will remain, because your light is greater, stronger, and eternal. May every mind be restored, aligned, and strengthened according to your purpose. And may the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard every heart and every thought in Christ Jesus. We come out of this moment different, transformed and sustained by your presence. In Jesus' name, amen. Everything you've heard so far hasn't just been information. It's a calling, a journey that began within the darkness of the mind and revealed, step by step, how God acts in real ways to bring light, order, and transformation. You've realized that it's not just about thinking positive or trying to control emotions, but about allowing God's truth to occupy every space within. This message is for you. God has chosen you to hear this today because there is something He wants to align within your mind, something that can completely change the way you live, feel, and decide. The question now is simple but profound. What are you going to do with all that you have received? I am very happy to know that you are here so far, walking together on this journey of faith. This shows that there is thirst in your heart, and that is precious. I want to invite you to take a simple but important step. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell if you haven't done it yet. But more than that, I want to get to know you. Right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, and this space can become a chain of faith where people pray for each other and find strength in God. And it doesn't end there. There is something even deeper that needs to be revealed. In the next video, you will understand how to keep that light burning daily, how to live steadily in the presence of God and not allow darkness to come back to dominate your mind. This is the next step in your journey, and it can open up a level of clarity and peace that you may not have experienced yet. Don't ignore it. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step in this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I wait for you in the next video.